Joining us now from Johannesburg is Thembisa Fakudi. He's a political analyst and a senior research fellow at Africa-Asia Dialogues. It's very good to have you with us, sir, on Al Jazeera. Thank you very much indeed. I'm just looking at some of the history between African nations and Russia, and it goes back a long way, and some of those relationships are very strong. It's clear that South Africa, in this case, is probably having to walk quite a fine line between making itself, shall we say, comfortable with the rest of the world, and at the same time, not trying to alienate Russia, which it so clearly needs.
That's very true, but it's also important to mention this fact that South Africa and most African nations had relations with the Soviet Union, not necessarily Russia as the country that we know of today. And many of the South Africans who were in exile during the days of the struggle against apartheid were based in Kyiv, in Ukraine. So there is that important factor to always mention, and I try very hard often to try and explain to South Africans that, you know, the blind and blanket support of Russia, as if Russia was the only country within the Soviet Union that supported South Africa, is actually misplaced.
That's an interesting distinction. Can you, just for the sake of us who are around the world, who are sort of watching this situation from the outside, can you describe to us the main differences between the relationship between African countries and the Soviet Union and African countries and Russia, as you put it, as a country?
Russia as a country came post-1990, if you remember. But before that, the Soviet Union consisted of various countries, and African politicians and activists were spread across, particularly South Africans, were spread across the Soviet Union. But most of the South Africans were in Ukraine, which was also part of the Soviet Union. So the current support, for me, as far as I'm concerned, is not well-placed, is misplaced. And the continuing support of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, again, doesn't make sense for those of us who have been studying and observing this development between the USSR, Ukraine, and the recent invasion of Ukraine by Russia.
One would understand if Russia was trying to capitalize on the relationship that has previously gone ahead between African nations and the Soviet Union. What do you think Russia, as a country, is trying to get out of these talks, particularly in South Africa today?
Well, firstly, it's here to kind of try and explain why it went on to invade Ukraine, because the public opinion in Africa and in South Africa in general is turning against Russia, given that we're continually seeing those disturbing pictures of wanton destruction of infrastructure and killing of innocent women and children, and just general mayhem. So I think Sergei Lavrov is here to want to try and explain to South Africans why they have done they continue doing what they're doing in Russia. But two is also to an extent, reassure Africans and South Africa that the flow of goods, particularly grain, that will be coming from Ukraine will reach the shores of African countries. Of course, notwithstanding that Russia has got no control of that. Turkey has got much more control because they control the waters that eventually lead to the Mediterranean and eventually to various shores in Africa. The other point is that South Africa has assumed the precedence of BRICS, and Russia and China are pushing for the expansion of BRICS. So I think one of the discussions that we'll be having with Naledi Pandor, the Minister of International Relations and Cooperation in South Africa, is to, lay those foundations. And by the time the summit occurs later on this year, the BRICS summit, at least those talks will have taken place.
The BRICS summit should just explain to some viewers who might not know, the BRICS, of course, is a trading body which also includes India, China, and Brazil, and so on. Given everything you've said, what kind of reaction do you think Sergei Lavrov and the Russian team are going to have? What kind of reaction do you think they're going to get when they are holding these talks from not only South Africa, but also African nations as well?
Well, first of all, they are going to hold these discussions with governments that are amicable to their plans and objectives in Ukraine. South Africa is one of those countries. I don't think they will go and speak to countries that are anti the invasion and war in Ukraine. And we've already seen in South Africa, outside those meetings, there are protests, albeit not as big as one would have expected, but people are already protesting the visit of Sergei Lavrov. So this is the kind of reception that he's getting from the civil society.
Tembisa Fakude, we appreciate you being with us on Al Jazeera. So thank you very much indeed for your time.